Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the global regulation of ICOs, brought to you by CoinDesk and DLA Piper. Today, we're going to look at what regulators in North America and Europe are thinking regarding digital token sales and what the panorama could look like going forward. I'm joined by a panel of experts on blockchain law who have deep experience in talking to regulators and issuers, and who are each coming at this topic from different vantage points. We're joined by Caitlin Long, who's co-founder of the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition. Good morning, Caitlin. Where are you calling in from?
Good morning. I'm in the New York area this morning.
Nice. And we have Amy Kim, who's the Global Policy Director and the General Counsel of the Chamber of Digital Commerce. Amy, where are you based?
We're here in D.C. Thanks, Noah.
And we have Mark Radcliffe, partner of law firm DLA Piper. Mark, where are you now?
I'm located in Silicon Valley, and I practice in the Silicon Valley office. So I'm calling in from California.
And we also have DLA Piper partner Martin Bartlam. Martin, where are you?
And I'm based in London, calling in from London.
So I think you say we can cover a fairly wide range of time zones. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Now, before we start, I'd like to remind our listeners that a recording of this webinar will be uploaded to the CoinDesk website within the next few days. So I invite you to listen again and also to encourage your friends and colleagues to do so too. Now, because we only have 60 minutes and a lot to cover, I'm going to jump right in. Caitlin, you're very well known in the blockchain sector, but for the newer listeners in our audience, tell us how you stumbled across blockchain technology and why you chose to focus on it.
Oh, gosh. We're going back to 2012 when I first came across Bitcoin. I got my first wallet in February 2013, and I found it through Austrian school economics circles. I was at the time at Morgan Stanley and have morphed a couple of times in the different things that I've done for this sector. Worked as a side gig on Morgan Stanley's blockchain working group, then spent almost a year and a half as chairman and president of Symbiont, and in January left and have worked primarily on the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition since then, which is a passion project of mine for my native state and for the industry I love.
Tell us about the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition. What are its goals and milestones?
Well, its goal is to facilitate the blockchain industry as an economic diversification opportunity for the state of Wyoming. And what we wanted to do was tear down barriers. The state of Wyoming is coal and cattle and now crypto. And we wanted to make it a place where we would attract companies not just to actually locate in Wyoming, that's not for everyone, but also to form their business entities in Wyoming. And that's the place where we already have had pretty great success. More than 200 companies since the laws passed in February have some blockchain-related name in them that have been filed with the Secretary of State of Wyoming. And we're not seeing that slow down anytime soon. In fact, I think it's accelerating.
Over 200. That's huge.
Yes.
Yeah. I love this. I love the slogan. We can see the new license plates for the state: coal, cattle, and crypto.
Right. And we're not done. I'm part of the governor appointed me to a task force to ensure that this goes well for the state. Obviously, we don't want fraudsters coming into the state, and we want to support the legitimate businesses, of which there are many, who are trying to form in Wyoming and comply with federal law, which obviously is the biggest obstacle. And so we're doing what we can to help. And we have a couple of new pieces of legislation that we recommended at the task force just last week, one of which is to look at a state chartered bank that would help solve a big problem for startups in the industry, which is that due to the Bank Secrecy Act requirements, most traditional banks can't bank the industry. So a lot of startups have had the experience where they've had their bank accounts yanked by traditional banks. Somebody just last week tweeted a response that their startup had been turned down by 20 different banks. And we're not talking about banking crypto. We're talking about just, plain old, simple, basic cash management accounts that pay your payroll. The banks just won't deal with this industry. And so that's one thing we're working on. And we're also working on another, which is which would make crypto assets legal tender in Wyoming. And the impact of that is that it would mean no sales taxes. We already exempted crypto assets from property taxes in the legislative session last February. And of course, there's no income tax, no corporate income tax, no franchise tax in Wyoming. So essentially, it makes crypto assets tax-free in Wyoming. So we're not done. We've got more on our agenda to try to support the industry and attract the businesses to Wyoming.
That's amazing, and congratulations. I'm so looking forward to seeing what else comes out of there. Amy,
yeah,
what
thank
were
you. It's been great.
Yeah, no, it's a huge congratulations, fascinating. And again, ton of questions that even just emerged from what you've been telling me, but we do need to move on. Amy, I want to ask you, what were you doing before you came across blockchain technology, and how did that happen?
Well, thanks, Noelle, and it's really hard to follow Caitlin's background, but I'll do my best. She's done a lot of great things for the industry.
Well, so have you, Amy. So have you.
My background is I spent the last 20 years in private legal practice, advising on cross-border compliance programs. So things like money laundering, sanctions compliance, trade, and investments. And started working with non-bank financial institutions, including virtual currency-oriented companies, around 2010. Since then, I've focused really on anti-money laundering and sanctions compliance and state money transmitter issues, which were a big deal early on, way back then, really, and then started working with Perry Ann here at the Chamber when she founded it in my spare time, and then just decided to go all in about a year ago and join the Chamber full-time.
And what made you decide to go full-time on this?
Well, just advising banks and non-bank financial institutions on financial services compliance, you could just see, and emerging payments and all of that, I could just see that really blockchain was where the future was going. And I just didn't want to be on the sidelines of that anymore.
And also,
advising, but now I wanted to be more involved in that. So,
and I guess the more you do, the more you realize how much there is to do.
Over
Tell us about the Chamber of Digital Commerce, and what are its goals?
Yeah, we're a trade association. We've got over 175 members and growing, so we're member-driven. And, we focus on promoting the acceptance and use of blockchain technology, whether it's by governments, private industry, or the public. And, we spend a lot of time doing education. Even after all this time, still, I think it's pretty varied, people's understanding and just involvement in what's going on in this industry and in the regulatory landscape, which I know we're about to talk about. And then where appropriate, we develop advocacy positions and present those. So it's busy in every sector.
Can you tell us about the Token Alliance?
Sure, that's so we organize working groups around some of our policy initiatives, and our most recent one is the Token Alliance, which really sprung up in reaction to some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. So really what's going on in the regulatory environment with tokens, and in particular with ICOs, both the good and the bad, and trying to really help to minimize the fraud that's going on in the industry and focus on the good companies, the good projects, and really promoting this type of tool in the industry.
Yeah, it sounds definitely necessary. Mark, what about you? How did you start looking into blockchain and why?
Well, I've been practicing in Silicon Valley for over 30 years, and what happened was one of my clients came to the firm and said, we'd represented him in a prior company, said, I'd like to get involved and do an ICO because I have a vision about a marketplace for personal information for healthcare. And that was a company called Doc AI, which went ahead and did its ICO. And this was in the middle of last year, and we thought this was a very interesting potential option to venture capital. And so we actually had a panel on July 12th, which included Natalia from Propi, Spencer Bogart from Blockchain Capital, Juan Benet from Protocol Labs, Vinny Lingham from Civic, and Matt Sherwitt from Smith & Crown. And so, ironically, that was almost 2 weeks before the SEC came out and gave their guidance. So it's still pretty much the Wild West. And as the Wild West continued to evolve, we continue to evolve with it. But we think, as a firm, that blockchain technologies are one of the most exciting developments we've seen in the last 20 years. And of course, ICOs also offer an opportunity for companies to raise capital in a very cost-efficient way, and so we're very excited about that too. And given the fact we have a global platform, we have offices in over 40 countries, we can help people deal with the regulatory complexity, which we're going to be discussing today. I work with Martin extensively on ICOs because most of these ICOs have international aspects to them, as we'll be discussing a little later on.
Yeah, you're right, and there's probably not very many institutions that can offer global advice on something this fragmented.
That's true.
And what kind of growth of interest are you seeing in your clients over there?
Well, I have to admit there was a lot of interest towards the end of last year. That interest has sort of declined a little bit because of the SEC statements, in particular Chairman Clayton's statement that every token offering he's seen is a security. But we had, what was very interesting is we had a number of companies with first-tier venture capitalists who are considering a token offering. And some of them are still considering it, although the regulatory ambiguity has been very troubling for them. And so if they have the alternative of getting traditional capital right now, I think many of them are getting traditional capital. But maybe it's just a straw in the wind. But recently we had there was a financing for a group called Untangled Labs for a stable coin, and they raised over $130 million based on basically staffed. In other words, there was no preferred stock or common stock, but it's led by traditional VCs. So you had people in there like Bain Capital and Lightspeed and Google, and so that was very interesting. So it may be coming back. I mean, obviously, everybody looks at what happened with Telegram, and we worked with a number of investors for Telegram back in January, and that, when somebody raised $1.7 billion in private offerings, the markets take notice. And so I think as a practical matter, we're probably going to see this come back, but maybe a little bit more slowly than we anticipated. And, I think the work of organizations like the Chamber and the National Venture Capital Association to clarify the regulatory environment are very important, because to date, I think that's been an enormous barrier for boards of traditionally financed companies and even new companies, although, once again, Untangled Labs was able to, get comfortable with that approach.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see what impact regulatory clarity, if we ever get it, will have. Martin, what dragged you into this?
So, well, for me, similar to Mark, it's really client-driven. What I've been doing, I've come from a slightly different angle, that I've been working in the securities and financing sector for nearly 30 years. But my area, my specialist area, is really around that securities and structuring work. And what I was seeing in the market was a real change in what clients were looking for. We're seeing a lot of new entrants coming in with a more sophisticated technology product, much lighter and more flexible in terms of their approach, but driven by use of the technology to create better online experience for customers, so more digitalization of product, quicker delivery, more efficient delivery at lower cost. And that trend really took off about 5 years ago, and has been building up. And into that came the whole blockchain movement. So my first experience there was a company that was looking to use blockchain to digitalize capital structures for businesses. So what they wanted to do was use the blockchain to offer traditional companies and businesses a different product, which enabled them to offer a digital share, a digital bond. And when we looked at it, again, all those regulatory issues that we're going to be talking about came to the fore, because they were a startup, they weren't authorized, They would have been introducing investors into this product. They wanted to do it again around their own businesses, and it created a whole host of different issues that I ended up sort of researching and understanding. In the end, for them, without getting authorization, they weren't in a position to go forward with offering a digitalization of capital products. But as a technology provider, using blockchain as a technology to others that were either authorized or simply using the technology for their own book, it created a mechanism for businesses to use this technology going forward. And from there, it's really built up from there. I mean, realizing the opportunities that blockchain brings to businesses, whether it's within the trading and settlement for traditional lending businesses, whether it's the application in fundraising through ICOs or other digitalization products. I mean, it's a huge step forward in terms of efficiency and reduced cost going forward in this space. So it's that client-driven approach which took me into this sector.
You were at the recent OECD workshop on digital assets. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Can you give us some background on that meeting? Why was it convened? Who was there?
Yeah, and this is probably one of the best meetings of senior level regulators that I've seen in this sector. This was convened by the OECD, and then really through the OECD had the ability to bring along some of the leading regulators. That included central bankers, it included FCA, ESMA, the Financial Stability Board. So it was a really high level combination of regulatory bodies that were able to come and express their views both positive and negative around the development of this ICO market. And that was also complemented by industry representatives, both from exchanges and academics, law firms, etc., that were bringing their perspective in relation to how this market is evolving. It was a great opportunity to hear on a multi-jurisdictional approach, how different organizations are approaching this, and we certainly got that perspective of the challenges between countries that are looking to promote growth, and they really see the opportunity and the benefits that blockchain and a funding tool like ICOs bring to developing opportunities in their economies, but also the difficulties around consumer protection, financial stability, anti-fraud, anti-money laundering issues. And how different countries and regulators are challenged in dealing with those issues. So it was a great window for seeing that perspective develop, and really have a great discussion around where everybody thinks they should be going.
And where are they at? I mean, what's the next step? Do they have some sort of timeline, and also do they know who would actually do the regulating?
Again, I mean, a very interesting and challenging point, because each country is to a large extent responsible for its own regulation and its own approach to regulation. As mentioned by Mark, Chairman Clayton, and views expressed in the US are having an effect in terms of the way people are viewing the positioning of the US in this market. We're seeing different regulators around the world take different approaches, whether it's China with a ban, India with concerns, to smaller states like Gibraltar and Switzerland that have actually been very proactive in terms of trying to create a framework where they can encourage the development of token products. So it's a different approach. In some ways, a different perspective on how the regulators or the countries are seeing the development of this product and its importance or role within their own respective economies. And how you bring that together in terms of how do you try and create a cohesive approach to something which is developing at different speeds and in different ways in different markets around the world. Now, IOSCO, which is probably the closest to an umbrella regulator for the regulators, in a sense, were there. And interestingly, they had recently come out with some principles and guidance, if you like, and they were talking about that approach. So they're not setting rules as such. They're not setting rules or laws or statements in stone. But what they are coming out with is they're trying to establish parameters or guidance for how individual regulators might start looking at this product. So guidance around risk assessment, investor protection risks, financial stability issues. And there's concern about forum shopping. How do regulators try and prevent forum shopping in what is essentially a fairly fluid and flexible global market product. So all these issues are coming to the fore, and a realization that there are issues that have to be dealt with, but also recognition of the difficulties in dealing with them without curtailing or damaging what is, I think, viewed as being a potentially huge opportunity in terms of using technology to drive forward growth on a global scale.
And for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with what IOSCO is and what it does, could you give us a brief summary?
So IOSCO is a body. It basically it has representatives from all the countries and regulators. So it's an umbrella body which can set standards effectively for regulators around the world.
So like the regulator, and what they're doing is issuing advice on what the various regulators around the world could do.
Exactly.
Amy, zooming out now, what impact do you think ICO regulation, if we one day get some sort of cohesive approach, what impact do you think that could have on blockchain development and innovation in general?
Wow, well, I feel like there's a lot to unpack in that question. To some extent, I think some would argue that there is ICO regulation out there already. If you're issuing a token that's a security, there's regulations that are surround that. There's certainly laws that impact fraud. You've seen some enforcement actions on the state level. Certainly, anti-money laundering and sanctions compliance would apply, and we saw that. That they could apply with respect to money transmission if there's facts and circumstances that justify it in FinCEN's letter to Senator Wyden a month or two ago. So certainly there's a lot swirling around out there, not to mention what are the tax and accounting implications of all this on the type of token that you may be generating and using. So there's a lot out there, and I think what people really are, at least the focus at the moment, is exactly what happened, or what Wyoming legislation sought to address, is what makes something a utility token or a token that is not considered a security or an investment contract under the securities laws, and therefore excluded from those registration and other record keeping or reporting requirements. And there's because this is a different type of technology that doesn't quite fit the paradigms that we've seen since when these laws were kind of set out in the 1930s and 40s. I think that's where the big question mark is. So, from our perspective, I don't know if we want to see regulation immediately, although that's a possibility. Also guidance, working with industry to make sure that it's not just, it's not too myopic, it's not too focused on what's happening, the snapshot of what's happening today, but takes into account some of the potential that we're able to, the foreseeable potential, and stand a bit of the test of time going forward.
At the moment, it does seem to be done on a state-by-state basis. Do you see that the norm going forward?
Well, I mean, we saw that there was an announcement last week that I think it was something like 40 states and some Canadian provinces had come together in an investigation to root this out at the state and the provincial level. So I definitely, we're seeing the states react on the enforcement side, and I think the converse of that is we're starting to see some states, Wyoming in particular, reacting in a positive way, trying to offer some of that clarity, at least at the state level, to welcome blockchain businesses. We saw Colorado attempt to do that. That appears to have failed. So we could see some more of that going forward. Some states, their legislative sessions have ended, so we might see renewed activity on the next go-around.
And when does that start, the next go-around?
It's state by state. So some states are still in their legislative sessions. Some don't start till January 1st. So it's a state-by-state exercise.
Okay, Caitlin, let's talk a bit more about Wyoming. Can you tell us a bit more about the HB 70 bill?
Sure. HB 70 was the first bill that was enacted by an elected body that recognized utility tokens as something distinct under the law. And specifically, under Wyoming law, utility tokens are subject neither to the state's securities laws nor the state's money transmission laws. And we enacted in Wyoming, with input from the securities industry, what I think is actually a model law for the federal standard if we ever get that sorted out, which I sure hope we will, because as Mark said in the beginning, the federal standard is the biggest obstacle that's pushing these businesses outside of the United States. And I can tell you, we've seen dozens of companies tell us they're trying to stay in the United States, but because of the federal issue, they're leaving. And Wyoming is sort of their last-ditch effort to stay. But the bill in Wyoming says that as long as you don't market the token as a financial investment, and one of four things are true, you are exempt from the law. And, by the way, you also have to file an advance notice with the Secretary of State. But those four things are that you reasonably believe the token was sold to the buyer for solely a consumptive purpose, so not an investment, that the consumptive purpose is available at or near the time of sale. So in other words, the technology is actually operating. If the technology is not actually operating at the time of sale, then you can't resell the token until it is. And if somebody does list it on an exchange, for example, then the issuer has to take reasonable precautions to prevent buyers from buying it. So that means getting out to the exchanges and asking them to pull the trading in the token. So it matches federal securities law, U.S. federal securities law, reasonably well. Certainly in intent and direction it does, but very, very importantly, it provides a state safe haven. A lot of the issuers, I think, are so focused on the federal issue, which is, of course, the prima facie issue, but then they'll pick a state like Delaware just simply because everybody goes to Delaware without really thinking through what are the state issues. Unfortunately, in the United States, you do have to do both the state and federal analysis as a new business.
Is there any chance that the federal law will override, say, the Wyoming law?
Great question. And in fact, Amy and I have worked a lot together, and we'll be doing more together on this federal issue because it is clear, it's a Supreme Court decision, so it's all the way to the highest court in the land, that if you are a security, federal securities laws trump state laws. That is clear. That is the Howey test, the famous Howey test case that came out of the Supreme Court, I think, in 1946. But if you are not a security, then what are you? And does federal law supplant? This is where the friction is. And a lot of token issuers are taking a position that they're not a security. They try to structure their transactions to deliberately fail the Howey test and therefore be outside of securities. One of the things Wyoming did was essentially create a new class of property. And under the law in the United States, property is pretty clearly established to be the purview of the states. So if you are property and not securities, then state law controls. most likely. If you are securities, then it's pretty clear federal law controls.
That's really interesting. How does the situation in Wyoming compare to Colorado? What happened in Colorado recently?
Yeah, actually a lot of folks that were working in Wyoming that came in from the community outside of Wyoming and helped at the legislative process in February took it to Colorado. And it literally passed, but then most of these states have what's called 3 readings, certainly both Wyoming and Colorado do, where it passes on the first couple of readings, but there's an option to revote at the end. And that's what happened in Colorado. And a couple of senators changed their vote because the attorney general came out against it at the very last minute. So it was heartbreaking because they were so close to getting a utility token bill very similar to what passed in Wyoming and Arizona through Colorado, and it failed literally at the last minute.
Will they get another chance, or is that done for now?
I don't have great insight into what happened in Colorado, but every time there's a new legislative session, there is another chance. It's a question at that point of what are the legislative priorities? Wyoming knew that because their session was only 20 days, they knew that if they didn't get the utility token bill and the other blockchain bills passed in February, that other states would leapfrog Wyoming. So Wyoming's chance to get out front was in February of this year. They don't have another legislative session until 2019. And so the interesting question for states like Colorado and other states where utility token bills have been proposed is where does it fall on the priority list? And if the state's not going to be early, just having worked in Wyoming, my fear is that means it falls down on the priority list because the state doesn't have a real opportunity to differentiate itself by being early, so other things take priority.
Mark, do you have any insight into what other states we should be keeping an eye on? Do you see this taking in others?
Well, I think it's a little difficult to say. Puerto Rico is obviously very active. Also, Arizona's been active in passing other laws relating to blockchain. But I think it's important to put this in context. I think because everybody focuses on the SEC quite properly, they may not understand the role that the states play. And I think this is where Caitlin's strategy was very sophisticated, because the states were actually the first governmental entities to regulate securities. In the early 20th century, they passed laws called the Blue Sky Laws because there were people who were making offers selling the blue sky. And it was really only after those Blue Sky Laws were in place that the federal securities law, the Securities Act of 1933, was passed. And states continue to have a very important role. For example, the Wolf of Wall Street, which I think everybody knows about, it got a lot of press about how the federal securities and the Department of Justice went after them. That investigation actually started from Alabama. I was on a panel with Joseph Borg, who's the security commissioner of the state of Alabama and a great guy. Also runs the Association of State Securities Administrators. He said that they started that investigation and eventually turned it over to the federal authorities. But, going back to the strategy here is the states have frequently been the labs for new regulations. And so I think, the Wyoming blockchain coalition's, work to get the law passed in Wyoming is a great start because, as I said, in many cases, regulatory change has come from the state levels and then bubbled up to the federal level. And so I think if we can get more states on board to pass these laws, hopefully we can persuade the SEC to take action too.
And with a more cohesive and coherent action, it'd be easier for people to actually set up the businesses in the first place. Eh?
Yes, absolutely.
Martin, in Europe, what does the security versus utility token debate look like?
Yeah, it's as you can imagine. I mean, it's the heart of the issue in how we go forward with this market. And certainly the debate is trying to create an understanding that for certain parts of the way this blockchain technology can enhance businesses, that where where the use of that technology is applied in a consumer or a utility type context, that creates the efficiency by allowing an open market for genuine customers, consumers, to buy or to use that utility service. And so confusing that with a securities token can be quite damaging from the point of view of whether the concept of the business can be made to work. Because what you can't have, the whole business structure doesn't really flow if you then have something which is a tokenized utility product where the only buyers are certain high net worths or authorized persons, because it's kind of losing the purpose of what that technology was designed to achieve from an efficiency perspective. So that's just to put on the table that that there is a big issue in this in terms of, does it matter whether you have a token which can be treated as a utility token. The other side of that equation, however, clearly is we don't want to have the fraudsters and even the naive who believe that if they tell a good story and they raise a lot of money, they will fulfill their dream by going and building their vision as to what a business should look like. And there was a lot of that in 2017 in particular. I think the market is maturing in Europe, and there's a bigger realization now in terms of that you can't just go and set up a website in your bedroom and raise $20 million and then potentially lose it all and say, oh well, it was a utility. I think there's a recognition that where a major force is in the fundraising, and it's fundraising to apply monies in the context of building a business, that probably should be caught by the securities regulations. And in Europe, if I talk from a UK perspective, we've got specific UK regulations under FISMA and related ancillary legislation, and then we've got Europe-wide directives and regulations that apply across the whole European forum, which are regulated and pushed by ESMA and others. Under both those sets of regulations, there is criteria which tokens could be caught under. It's slightly different from the US approach because it's not a how we test approach. What we have in the UK is a kind of list of different types of specified instruments, which if you're dealing in, you may be regulated for. If you're doing an offering of, then you have to comply with certain requirements. And that ranges it ranges from equity type securities through debentures through to electronic money, payment services. All of these have to be analyzed in the context of what the token is doing as to whether it's a regulated instrument, which means it can only be offered in a certain way. And if it is subject to any of those regulations, it's quite right that should then be subject to the existing securities laws. And the securities laws have operated for decades quite effectively and efficiently in allowing money raising in that context to go forward. So my perspective is that the regulators are not anti-tokenization or ICOs. What they're concerned about are whether people are properly understanding the application of the existing rules in the context of tokens and ICOs.
It could be a question of defining them better and then just applying the existing laws. No?
So one of the projects, I'm working with a group called Global Digital Finance at the moment, where we're trying to produce a taxonomy and a code of conduct exactly around this kind of subject, so people get a clear idea of what's intended by the different types of tokens that are being created or may be issued. But a lot of it goes back to I think it was Amy that was describing, I think Mary Kendall was describing kind of understanding the context of what is being offered. If you're offering a token to, and I often use the cinema example for this, but basically, if you tokenize cinema tickets and you sell cinema tickets in digitalized form for the same sort of price that you would the cinema ticket, that doesn't turn it into a security. It's just a more efficient way of selling cinema tickets. You can get it on your iPhone, and you can turn up your iPhone, and you get access to the cinema. No one should suggest that that is a securities offering that needs to then go through the regulators for approval. On the other hand, if you sell a whole bunch of cinema tickets in digitalized form because you want to build a cinema, and you're only selling them to people who are never going to watch the films, they're basically financial investors who are interested in business development, the business opportunity of building the cinema and getting a return off the back of it, then that's much more like an equity security and probably should be regulated in accordance with the existing securities rules. The actual ticket itself, or the digital token, is the same in both instances. And that's what the difficulty is. And yet, I think if you actually apply a common sense approach to the analysis of the difference in use and buyer and risk, you actually can most times come up with a fairly clear distinction between the two. And then it's recognizing that distinction in the way that the securities laws work, whether it's in the UK, the wider Europe under the European regulations and directives, or frankly in other jurisdictions around the world.
Amy, you alluded to this before, the possibility in the US there are existing securities law. Do you see perhaps one day that the digital tokens that are emerging could be regulated by the current system and it would just be a case of new definitions? Or do you think that the state approach and the SEC statements are going to be the way forward, crafting new definitions and regulations?
Well, I mean, that's interesting. And I think that's still an open, question that we'll be working through in the coming months and potentially years. But, so far what we've seen, at least on the federal level, the states are clearly different. But on the federal level, we've seen guidance issued and not laws. And I think that has been an appropriate way to handle this so far because it allows the regulators to provide guidance to the industry, which helps, with predictability and clarity and things like that, to the extent that the guidance is well written. But it's more readily updated or amended or supplemented. So FinCEN issued guidance in 2013, and since then they've issued a good handful of advisory letters clarifying certain points with respect to specific circumstances. So far, I think that's worked in an industry that is moving at the speed of light. It's just things, so last week almost, what happened last week.
True, yes. So I imagine guidance would be faster as well now. I expect Caitlin's experience in getting a bill passed in Wyoming so fast is probably an outlier.
Certainly. Well, and as she said, they had 20 legislative days. Certainly the state legislative calendar is shorter. They may be able to be a little bit more nimble based on, just what they are and their organizational structure and the way that they go about legislating. And I think that whole situation shows that, with what's going on at the federal level and a lot of regulators, while still having some uncertainty as to some of the gray areas between those, you've seen that reaction in the states doing what they can do to help promote blockchain. And not just Wyoming, there's a good handful of states that are introducing different types of legislation just to point out that, hey, my state's open for business. And I think that's one reaction of what we've seen to this kind of the federal gray matter that we're dealing with right now.
Supporting the innovation.
That. I'm sorry.
Jump in, Mark.
This is Mark. I do think we're seeing some signs that the federal regulators understand that they need to give more guidance. There was some testimony from William Hinman, who's the director of the Division of Corporate Finance of the SEC, in front of Congress, and he was asked expressly, can a utility token exist? And on April 26th, he responded, yes, they can, and then he described the characteristics of it. So I think that the SEC regulators understand that they need to provide more guidance. On the other hand, I think we also need to understand the challenges faced by the regulators, which is, given the wave of massive fraud that's out there, it's really easy for them to focus on the fraud because one of their core mandates is basically to protect the retail investor. But at the same time, I think they understand there are going to be use of this which are legitimate and valuable. And the problem is, first they have to sort of deal with the fraud issue and all the dubious characters out there, but and then they need to think more globally about compliance. And I think that's beginning to happen. And I guess what I would say is we're seeing most companies that are using tokens to raise capital for future platforms are doing it through what's called the SAFT structure, the Simple Agreement for Future Tokens, which sort of delays the actual token launch until the system's up and running or moving offshore. So I've got two companies right now. One's raising through Gibraltar, one's raising through Cayman, but both of them are avoiding selling SAFs in the U.S. So I think that's a sort of a development in the last 2 or 3 months, I would say.
Becoming increasingly international, and that's very interesting. Amy, you mentioned FinCEN, and I understand you have background with FinCEN. What's your take on the recent FinCEN letter saying that ICO exchanges and developers should be money transmitters?
Yeah, that's interesting, and I apologize. I think I'm hearing a little bit of feedback on the line, but when that FinCEN letter came out, which they were, responding to an inquiry from Senator Wyden. I don't think that it said anything that was a surprise. The Bank Secrecy Act, which is the law that FinCEN administers and enforces, it applies to financial institutions, and some of those, one category of financial institution is money transmitters, and the money transmitter regulations apply to businesses that receive or transmit funds or the value of funds, and it's a facts and circumstances test. So if you have an ICO, just like any other business that might receive funds or the value of funds, which could be a virtual currency, from one person or location to another person or location, you could also be engaged in money transmission. Now that's a very technical, I've spent lots of time on helping clients and past clients figure out if they are triggering that or not. So that's not, I don't think that's necessarily a straightforward question that would be a case-by-case basis. But they were essentially just stating what their law says and what their jurisdiction is. So I think that a lot was made of it because we had really focused on the SEC versus potential CFTC jurisdiction, and now FinCEN was in the mix. But I don't think it was much of a surprise. And I think also sanctions compliance, which is under OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, also needs to be considered, among other things. There's lots of laws, and one thing that our Token Alliance will be publishing is a legislative or legal framework of the laws that could impact token generation events in the U.S. and other countries. So that would be
so given. Yeah, so for those of us looking from the outside, it is getting increasingly confusing with the alphabet soup of regulators looking at it all from different ways. One thing I wanted to ask, Kate, and I'll ask this to you. Let's say the institutions, the regulatory institutions, arrive at a broad agreement, or say they even continue along their current path. What will happen to the ICOs that are already out there?
That's a good question. It comes down to how many enforcement actions the SEC has an appetite to take. The most famous action by the SEC, of course, was that of the DAO, where they came out and said, look, this was a security, but we're not taking enforcement action, and essentially it's a slap on the wrist. I think that was a shot across the bow for everyone to pay attention to federal securities laws, and it's certainly been my experience, the vast majority have, and their reaction has been they can't stay in the United States because there are places like Switzerland and Singapore where there are more friendly regulations welcoming them. But it is also worth noting, the SEC really didn't come down and hasn't come down on pretty much anything that wasn't an outright fraud, where there was active misrepresentation and extremes. I will say this: there's a tremendous paper that just came out of Boston College on May 20th that analyzed, it's an academic analysis by Hugo Benedetti and Leonard Kostovetsky, I hope I'm pronouncing those correctly, analyzed ICOs and found that the average ICO investor sees returns of 82%. And so in spite of all of the fraud, of which clearly there has been a lot, this has actually been a real market. It's now large enough in size and starting to attract institutional money, as Mark pointed out. It's becoming mainstream. And just to put it into perspective, in the first quarter, the ICO market raised $6.3 billion. That was 40% of the size of the IPO market in the traditional, securities in traditional stocks. And it was 30% of the size of the total venture capital amount invested in the first quarter. So this is very real, and it's easy for us when we talk about regulation to focus on the fraud, but there's fraud in everything, and it's actually been a pretty small amount of the overall industry. And we don't want to have the baby thrown out with the bathwater. I think Chairman Clayton's statement that he hadn't seen an ICO that wasn't a security kind of unfortunately threw the baby out with the bathwater, and they've walked it back, thank goodness. But it is clear, at least from what I'm hearing, not as a practicing attorney, but just seeing the traffic coming through Wyoming, that it's clear as mud right now. It's clear that it's clear as mud. And we really do need some federal standards. I would love to ask Mark and Amy to talk about how that's going to evolve. Is it going to come from Congress? Is it going to come from the SEC itself? Or is it going to have to come through litigation?
Mark?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that it's unlikely to come through Congress because Congress is not terribly functional these days. I think it's going to come possibly litigation, although generally, at least some of the cases that are moving forward now are pretty unsympathetic, where it's basically fraudsters claiming it's not a security. But I think it's most likely to come from regulatory rulings by the SEC. It could be issuing regulations. There's the NVCA, National Venture Capital Association, to avoid alphabet soup, is pushing for Reg Crypto. But there are also, I think, the possibility of what are called no action letters, which is a way for the SEC to basically give the SEC a set of facts and say, we don't think this is a security, or we don't think this is subject to a particular, regulation of the SEC, and the SEC responds and either agrees with you or doesn't agree with you. So that's a way of getting clarity in the interpretation of regulations without, going to court. And so the problem, of course, with no action letters is if you go ahead and the SEC disagrees with you, then you have a problem. So right now, I know there's a lot of dialogue going on with the SEC where people are trying to understand what the SEC's position is, and I think in fairness, the SEC is trying to understand this industry. So I think the most likely avenue for clarity is coming from the SEC either proactively or through these no action letters. But Amy, you may have other thoughts. So.
I know I would agree with that. I mean, I think all of those variables are essentially out there, until there's a little more clarity, I think, as far as where the regulators stand, whether it is through a no action letter or some other vehicle. I think all of those options are potential avenues, and with individuals who can, like you said, potentially write a no action letter or litigate. I mean, we're certainly a litigious group, society. I mean, so that's why I think, from our perspective, it's imperative to try to get some clarity as early as possible to avoid that and to help a healthy marketplace grow.
On that approach,
I would just say that I think for people who are looking for clarity, they ought to be working with groups like Caitlin's Wyoming Blockchain Coalition and the Chamber of Digital Commerce, because the most effective way of getting a result here is to work in a coalition, not just go individually. But I think ultimately, given the importance and the profile here, having a coalition is pretty critical to be successful.
And a bit like what Martin was telling us about all the regulators getting together in Paris at the OECD meeting and talking to each other. I have a question on the green light approach that you're talking about, the no action letters from the SEC. That does require sort of case by case study. Does the SEC have the capacity to do that? Is that scalable?
I'm not sure it's scalable, but generally what happens with no action letters is, once again, people set out the facts, and then they will, provide a reason as to why, for example, it's not a security or, whatever goal they're trying to achieve. And you're not going to get a ruling for each individual situation. What you do is you basically get a ruling on or issue, and then you use that as to interpret your factual situation. So, for example, Regulation S, which is a regulation for selling, for avoiding U.S. securities laws through taking certain actions by issuing shares overseas or issuing securities overseas. A lot of the regulations clarified through these no action letters on issues, such as the definition of what it means to have 50% of securities owned by U.S. residents, like that. So the point is, you're not going to get it for each individual offering, but if you get it for a couple, then you'll have more guidance as to where to go. Just frankly, like some of the guidance we got in the Munchie decision, and to a lesser extent, Dow was very helpful in giving us guidance for the offerings that are going now, except for the fact that it's security. So it's not going to be individual. It's going to be you'll get a couple, and you'll be able to extrapolate from that.
And then it comes down to sort of self-regulation in a way, because after all, as you mentioned, Mark, the people are being very careful where you are and thinking things through more carefully. Martin, over where you are, do you see a similar approach possibly working?
Yes. I mean, I think there is a lot of effort going in now from a regulator's perspective, I like to think that they are making a real effort to understand the balance between innovation, just market change and consumer protection and financial stability. I think those are all relevant, and I think the regulators are actually thinking that through. Obviously, in the UK, we've got the regulatory sandbox approach, which provides a mechanism for potential issuers to go into a kind of protected regulatory envelope and work with regulators to try and develop ideas. In addition to that, there's forums for having these discussions. It's been great to see regulators turning up at some of the industry body discussions about how we can create better market practices, codes of conduct for the industry. I hope that my hope is that we don't go down a formulaic or route towards regulation of this industry, because the flexibility and breadth of this industry, I think, will be curtailed if we end up with a lot of different regulators putting formal rules in place for different jurisdictions where they are regulating. We already see that. Some of the larger international offerings that we're engaged in these days, we actually have to. It might be 10 jurisdictions where half of those jurisdictions have already implemented some kind of regime, which may be completely different between from regime to regime. So the same approach and the same token can be regulated as a virtual currency in one jurisdiction, a security in another jurisdiction, and neither a virtual currency or a security in another jurisdiction. So we're already seeing a kind of complexity come from if we get a patchwork of regulation, and my hope is it does go down more towards understanding of what the relevant risks and issues are, probably guidance around appropriate practices, more emphasis around making sure the industry has appropriate measures in place, and that's everything from how you do the original offering right through to ongoing reporting afterwards, which is pretty appalling at the moment. So there's a lot of things that need to be developed in order to make this a sustainable sector. But there's a lot of application going in now, including at the very senior levels in government and amongst regulatory bodies.
And that's really encouraging. And with all of this work going on, I'm sure we'll be seeing some very enlightening announcements coming out from both ends of the pond. I wish we had another hour to keep talking about this. There's so much I still want to ask, but we have run out of time. I'd like to give a special thanks to our panelists. And Caitlin, where can people find out more about what you're doing?
Oh, the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition website, or caitlin-long.com is my blog.
Yeah, thanks. Amy, how can people follow what you're up to?
We are online at digitalchamber.org.
And Mark, how can people keep in touch with you?
So they can go to the website, www.dlapiper.com.
And Martin, if people wanted to get hold of you, how would they do so?
So again, you can go through the website based in London. We also have a web offering, which is Financial Rules of the World, and a FinBrief section, which is really trying to update people on some of these regulatory changes that are coming through, day to day, week to week.
Great. Well, I invite all of our listeners to take a look at that. Thank you all so much for joining us. And as I said at the beginning, the recording of this webinar will be uploaded to the CoinDesk website soon. Thanks again to our panels, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.